Okay, so there's a couple things we can do to kind of bring these all together. So the first things first, I think this is too much of a contrast between the sky. So what we could do is we could take this selection and we can kind of do a dodge and burn type situation. We could do like a burn tool and kind of burn this out a little bit to make it less contrast between the dark sky and the bright grass. So I'm just going to take our main slide. I'm just going to directly edit the layer this time because I want this to be a permanent change. Sometimes use just non-destructive editing, sometimes you don't worry about it. Let's see if shadows can kind of help to kind of bring that in a little bit more. Do highlights, do a nice big brush to kind of slowly integrate that in. Go ahead and just painting on some burn tool, and then we could do dodge, bring out certain areas here. But that might be a little bit too much. I'm just going to not do any highlights there. So you see how that already looks a little bit better. I'm going to take our selection here. I'm going to just get the eraser. Actually, this is a layering mask. So I want to paint black to go ahead and trim that selection. I'm just going to feather that background a little bit. It looks a little bit more like a smooth transition. Okay. Let's continue to add. I'm directly editing the layer. I'm going to continually add the burn tool, just trying out midtones and highlights and shadows to really make sure that blends in nicer with the star background. So I decided to remove all of the shadows here and the door, and I wanted to go ahead and paint the long cast shadow because I think that might look a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer, and this is going to be door shadow. And we're just going to do one long casted shadow down here. Let me get a bigger brush. Just painting with the paintbrush tool. Just one long casted shadow. Okay, and I'm just going to go and reduce the opacity quite a bit. You just see a little bit of the shadow cast from the door. And I could even draw a little bit here, do a new layer. Just kind of do a little bit of a darker one right at the foot of the door and blur that a little bit. So it's a little stronger at the door, but slowly gets a little lighter as it fades out. And one thing I noticed with this door is it's going to have this, it has this translucent window. And I thought it'd be neat if we showed a little bit of that background through that window, but just a little bit, because since it's kind of got this frosted glass effect to it. So what I thought I'd do is go ahead and select this window and go back to our door layer. And right now I have a layer mask on. So I went ahead and added a layer mask because I don't want to actually delete anything from the door just in case I decide to add the window back at another time. And so I want to be able to erase it. So I'm going to go ahead and grab black. Anytime you want to erase from a layer mask, you want to use black. And I want to do a very little opacity. I don't want the window to go completely away. So I'm just doing a 9% opacity. And I'm going to paint in and maybe paint a little bit up top so you can see the birds kind of showing through. Just like that. So you can kind of see the translucent part of the door. You see the birds, but you don't see anything else coming through. And that looks to be kind of a solid piece of wood, so that probably wouldn't be a window, although we could make it a window. We're finally done fiddling around with it. Let's get down to business. Let's make all of this cohesive. So I'm going to start with the door and slowly work through all of our objects to bring them to a more realistic lighting with each other. So I have the door selected. I'm going to go ahead and select the door. And I'm going to do some dodging and burning. So I'm just going to kind of make the door overall a little bit darker. It had a lot of highlights from its previous place where we cut it out. It was kind of in a dark area with trees, and so we're just gonna kind of bring down some of those highlights and then switch back and forth between your dodge tool. Okay, and I'm going to take the burn tool, do a pretty small brush. I'm just going to brush along the outside just to kind of make sure that trim doesn't have too much highlights going on. I'm just eyeballing this, seeing what looks good. Okay, now we're going to do our girl. So our girl kind of has some strange effects. She seems to have a low contrast to her, and the door has a really high contrast. So we can select our girl and see what we can do with contrast. So brightness and contrast in my adjustments panel. Let's see if we can't increase the contrast. Notice this is kind of low contrast. You kind of see more of the grays, or kind of more neutral tones. And increasing the contrast adds way more highlights and shadows to the girl. Kind of makes her feel like her and the door now go better together. So if I do a Command Z, this was before and this is after. So it helps out just a little bit. Let's add a little bit more saturation to her, because everything we have is so saturated with color. So let's make sure she has a similar saturation. We can also paint saturation on her by doing the sponge tool and going up to saturate. So I'm on the sponge tool, which could be right in your dodge and burn. I'm going to saturate her dress. I don't want to saturate maybe her legs too much. So now I'm just doing some minute editing, and I can even desaturate her legs so they don't look too peachy or red. Bring out certain areas. So we kind of have a shadow cast here, so maybe the light is coming in this way, so it's going to be more bright right here than it would be over here. And with our burn tool, we could cast some shadows over here. This is kind of where more of the light is being blocked. Okay, and so we have our night sky. So our night sky, when you have a when you're taking a photograph, you want to be able to have, right now there's nothing in focus, everything's in focus. And so what you want to do is emulate what a camera would do, which would be focusing on the foreground or a particular subject and blurring the background. So we're going to do an iris blur on this background graphic to kind of give the effect that this was taken with a camera, and it'll take the focus off all of this sharp imagery up here and really focus the eye on this subject matter. So I'm going to go up to Filter, Blur, Gallery, and I'm going to do the iris blur. So we're going to do an iris blur here. Let's go ahead and get our circle here. We want the focus to be on the door, just like that. Let's back off the blur a little bit. We don't want everybody to see exactly where it starts to blur. I'm going to go ahead and click OK and see how that looks. So that's before and that's after. So it just adds a little bit more focus into the center area. And I also want to dull down the color a little bit, because it's almost, these two are not jiving together as well. We can also take the dodge tool, or we can even add a layer. We're going to paint on just black. Just have the paintbrush tool, just painting on black right here. Go ahead and make sure that layer is above. I'm going to go to there's my star layer. What's going on? So I'm just kind of adding a little bit more night sky here. And then I'm going to go down and decrease the opacity just a tad. So this is kind of, I don't know what I want to call this, darkening layer, sky, darkening sky. So I'm going to toggle that off and on. I just painted on some black just to kind of do that. I can also do a blending mode if I want it to have a certain effect. So let's do the grass too. Maybe there's a little bit of blurring in the background, but not in the foreground. So I'm going to do an iris blur again. We could also do a field blur too, because that'll be a horizontal blur. Let me see how this looks. I'm going to do just a very little bit of blurring on the very edges, the left and the right sides. Not a whole lot. Okay, so let's see how that looks. So before and after, kind of blurs it a little bit in the foreground to bring a real sharpness, almost like the camera was focusing on this part of the foreground. It's like the brightness and the contrast are all about the same, but now color is totally off. The colors are all so different. So we're going to try, there's a couple things we can do to bring all the colors together, and we're going to do that next.